So the shape of the hand is the vehicle that they're born into. And then when you look at the lines on the hand, you're looking at how a person is steering that vehicle. So the line formations will tell you whether that person is trying to drive their boat down the road and whether they'd be better off actually floating it on the water somewhere, and so forth. And then when we've got the fingers, that's a different dimension. It's to do with the knowledge that we can draw from in order to be more educated as to how to steer our vehicle.
Welcome to Coffee and Divination, a podcast about the arts of obtaining hidden knowledge in changing times. Join me, Joanna Farrar, to chat with experts from around the world on tarot, runes, geomancy, and the many ways divination can help us navigate and plan our paths ahead.
So I'm very happy to introduce our guest today, Mr. Dylan Warren Davis. He is a second-generation herbalist. He is an author and a practitioner of Cheiromancy, also sometimes known as hand reading or palm reading or palmistry. He is the author of the classic text on Cheiromancy, The Hand Reveals, which was recently re-released for its 4th edition, which includes some expanded information about the Western Hermetic tradition as it relates to the art form. He is an author that has also contributed a section on palmistry to the Oxford Companion to the Body, published by Oxford University Press. And he has been reading hands and speaking about Cheiromancy for over 40 years now. So it is a very great pleasure for me to have you on the podcast, and thank you for being here.
Thanks very much, Joanne. It's a pleasure to be here as well.
So I wanted to get started. I don't really have traditional questions for the podcast, but there is one thing that I generally like to start off with, which is asking, is there a first memory that you have of the art of divination? Was there someone in your family who, read tea leaves or read tarot cards, or some way that you were first introduced to divination or these kinds of occult things? Or was this something that you discovered later on?
I think my family were open-minded towards a whole range of sort of forms of divination, but not specifically hand reading, other than amongst my mother's library there was a book on hand reading, and I looked at it and sort of mulled it over and just put it back on the shelf at the time. Mm-hmm. But as with all these things, the timing is right for when something is meaningful for you. And it started with the very first seminar that I attended in my training to become a medical herbalist. And I'd had an appalling time at school, and this was a subject that I felt I really wanted to learn. And my immediate instinct was with that seminar was to get right down to the front bench, right in front of the speaker, so I could sort of get maximal attention and sort of volume of voice and so forth. And so the bell rang to commence the morning, and I walked down one aisle towards this table, and at the corner of my eye I spotted another girl also moving down the parallel aisle. And we got to the bottom, got to the table, and we'd chosen the same table to sit at. And we pulled out the chairs completely sort of in unison. We sat down, we looked into each other's eyes, and both said hi simultaneously. And we were just sort of gobsmacked by what had just transpired. If you kind of had to film something like that, and to sort of stage manage it, to get 2 actors to kind of fill that role, to say hi immediately to each other in the same context, it would be very, very difficult. I met this girl, Barbara, her name, and ultimately we kind of worked together. But that evening, a whole group of us, there was possibly 30 or so students, and we're all interested in getting to know each other. We all started the course at the same time. So we had lots to discover, somewhat overwhelmed by 30 people. Just we ordered our food and then we waited ages and ages and ages for the service to actually happen. And Barbara was sitting next to me and she just grabbed hold of my hand and said, "Can I read your hand?" And I said, "Yeah, go for it." And so she read my hand, and within 10, 20 seconds, she was suddenly rattling off details about my life. I think, how on earth could she possibly know that? You know, she's only just met me, and yet she is bang on with her observations there. And that sort of intrigued me. Anyway, we became firm friends, and in my herbal training, I suppose about a year on, I encountered a sort of philosophical problem in that in learning Western herbal medicine, we were learning it in a way that was just regular medicine, like medics would study, only instead of drugs, we're learning about herbs. And inherent in that is the Western medical model is a sort of like biomedical model of it's just a mechanical object with lots of different bits that can go wrong. And various drugs just intervene to kind of compensate, to suppress certain pain or inflammation and so forth. And I inherently disliked that point of view. And I knew from practicing yoga for many years that I wanted a diagnostic system that looked at the whole person, not just our physical existence. And I chewed over various diagnostic systems, and the one that had the most immediate appeal was hand reading. By then, I was working for my mother as a dispenser. She had a practice in London, and she needed an additional dispenser. I worked part-time, and there was space for someone else to work part-time. So I immediately contacted Barbara, and she said, yeah. And well, she started, I think, the next couple of days. So our friendship was immediately activated, and we entered into this sort of philosophical debate, and we did a lot of studying together. One day she came in with an essay, and she gave it to me, and it was entitled "The Basis of Intuitive Diagnosis." And I thought, wow, that's an interesting title. I immediately read it. It wasn't very long, but it also wasn't very specific. But from the way it was written, I thought, this guy knows what I am after. And I asked, well, who is this guy? Who wrote it? And I said, well, as a matter of fact, this guy is my yoga teacher and has also taught me hand reading. So I thought, yeah, I think I'll go with this guy. I'd like to meet him. And the following day, Barbara phoned me up and said, hey, Dylan, there's a party on tonight. And Terry, my teacher, will be there. So I immediately sort of jumped at the opportunity. And when I arrived at the party, there was my teacher with a whole sort of entourage of people around him, having a big philosophical debate about various issues, metaphysical ideas and so forth. And I was very periphery to it. And in fact, I just listened the whole evening to him. And I thought, because there's about 20 people in the room, that he hadn't noticed me. So I thought, well, it's time to go home now. I'll just sneak off. And I almost got out of the room, and he shouted out, hey, Dylan, when are you coming to one of my classes? I was just gobsmacked. A, he knew my name without being introduced to me. and B, that I wanted to study with him. So he then said, right, well, I've got a new class starting next week, be there. So I did. And that was the start of this amazing interaction I had with him.
Yeah.
And at the first day, I had an opportunity for a conversation with him after the yoga class. There was a group of us around a table, and everyone was jabbering away. And I then asked him about this basis of intuitive diagnosis. And it was like all the conversation died away, and it was like pushed back, and we had a sort of one-to-one, heart-to-heart situation. And he said very simply, well, if you study with me, there will be, in 2 years' time, a number of you seated around this table will be able to understand what intuitive diagnosis is. And I was just gobsmacked, and suddenly, boom, it was like this parting, reconnected, and there was just a general cacophony of everyone chatting around the table. And it made a big impression on me. So I did the Chinese yoga, it was Chinese Buddhist yoga, for about 2 years. And then at the end of it, Terry said to me after one of the classes, he said, you don't do hand reading, do you? And I said, no. Right, I've got a class next week starting. So I turned up to that. And that was for me one of the sort of eureka moments of my life. And that from that very evening, I knew this was a subject I wanted to learn. And I just took to it like a duck to water. It was as effortless as if I'd studied the knowledge before, and I was just once again reconnecting with it. So that within 3 months, I was teaching it and started to doing it professionally. And as a herbal student, I mean, we didn't get a grant or anything like that to pay for training, yet alone our existence. I was able to read hands and teach, and with that I earned enough money to sustain the whole latter portion of my herbal training. So that's basically how it all started, with that.
That's fantastic.
Amazing meeting with Barbara in the Indian restaurant.
And that answers another question that I had for later, but it's clearly that practice of hand reading and this art form is very tied into that question of healing and health and diagnostics and stuff like that. So you've already kind of touched on that. I want to go deeper into that, obviously, a little bit later, but just for people who are listening, and I mean, people have encountered palm reading and things like that. It's in pop culture. It's a thing that everyone kind of has some idea of. But if you had to give someone a really, brief introduction to what it is, you're at a cocktail party and you just want to give the basics of it, particularly like the Western form that you practice, how would you describe it?
Hand provides a mirror of your whole temperament, individuality, your whole person, your whole being. And I think it's much, much bigger than just the fortune telling perspective most people conceive of as soon as you mention hand reading. I mean, initially when I started hand reading, as I mentioned, my teacher was a Chinese Buddhist priest. And so he taught the Chinese Buddhist hand reading. And if you know anything about Buddhas, you see these Buddha rupas, little statues of the Buddha in various poses and postures. And what is also shown throughout these little Buddha rupas are differing hand positions. Sometimes they're in sort of meditation, if I just hold my hand up like that, held in the lap. Others may be a hand held up the side like that one way, and then down the other way in the sort of bodhisattva position. There's many, many more. So within Buddhism, which several thousand years old, there was immense respect for the hand, and they even saw that the hand was a vehicle, if you like, to communicate Buddhist teachings. So there are particular mudras, particular symbolic positions that all communicate information, the Buddhist Dharma. More than that, one of the most important things about hands is the lines change. The lines are linked with the consciousness of the person. And in one of the most dynamic ways that the lines can change is where people learn meditation. And through that, they're kind of elevated from the limitations of their current conflict, difficulties, struggles, and so forth, and are able to get a higher view that sort of transcends it. And with that comes sort of peace, much greater harmony, resolve stress, much more inspired, and so forth. And as people enter into a more sort of transcendent state, so the lines can change very, very rapidly. And I've got a good example of that in my book. And I'm sure this has been recognized for centuries. And for that reason, hand reading was seen as an instrumental part of the spiritual journey, the spiritual evolution. So that's why it's so highly regarded in the Orient. In the West, of course, it is sort of degenerate fairground fortune-telling stuff or after-dinner party stuff, which doesn't really do justice to it. But I think from a diagnostic perspective, Sigmund Freud, the father of modern psychology, he actually said no psychological analysis was complete without an inspection of the hand. So he placed enormous importance upon it. And Carl Jung, who kind of succeeded Freud in many respects, he didn't actually focus on hand reading in his life, but he had a friend in Julius Speer who wrote a book called The Hands of Children. And Julius Speer asked his friend Carl Jung to write a foreword for it. And I'm paraphrasing here because it's so many years ago since I read it, but basically he said that it's with great regret that he never studied hand reading as part of all his psychological investigation that he did. So had he focused on it, then I'm sure he would have gained enormous insight into its importance.
And so that importance and what it's showing about the internal state of someone is very important. And like you said, was looked at by Freud and many other people, and has deep roots in the Hermetic tradition and the Western Hermetic tradition, which you talk a lot about in your book, and kind of go into at least kind of setting the groundwork for people to understand that, in order to understand what they're seeing on the palm, on the hand, and how it might reflect larger trends in a person's life. And that kind of goes back to the Hermetic idea of, like, as above, so below, or the microcosm and the macrocosm. So one of the other things, which is a great easy question I want to ask you, is I wanted to know if you could, for people who are less familiar with what Hermeticism is and what Hermetic philosophy is, if even for people who are, I'm always interested to see how people would distill that down and explain it, because there's so many different ways you could you just explain in brief kind of your idea of Hermeticism and why that's important for chiromancy and these studies?
Well, basically the origins of Hermeticism are found in Egypt. In sort of Egyptian mythology, there's this character called Hermes Trismegistus, who's a sage-like character, and his teachings have been imparted, written down. And the very essence, if you like, of this Egyptian religion was Hermetic teachings. And I think in many ways it's a knowledge that has permeated through Western culture. I mean, you can see it within Christian teachings. It's not insignificant that Jesus spent his early years growing up in Egypt, where he would have been exposed to all sorts of teachers. But the Bible doesn't include that. In the first 30 years of his life, it's entirely missing in the Bible. But if you look in the various churches that line the Nile, they actually have frescoes on the wall showing the Holy Family fleeing Palestine and moving to Egypt. And there's local legends of the Holy Family passing this way and so forth. So I'm sure Jesus studied a lot of Hermetic teachings, as indeed other teachings as well. Christianity, I think, is much, much bigger than most people conceive of as Christianity today. So the actual principle of Hermetic teaching is the form and structure of the body as a reflection of your whole kind of inner universe. As above, so below, and the physical universe is an expression of what is going on inside you. So when you look at the hand, one of the basic principles of reading the hand is that the form and structure of the hand, all its features and formations, are an expression of that which is within the person. And the two kind of coincide. So if you think of the old-fashioned conventional cinema projector with the film passing through, when a film like that is sort of running, you've got two images. One is the image on the film as it's passing through the lenses and through the optics of the projector. And the second image is the one that's on the screen that everyone is watching. One image you cannot see because it's inside the projector, and the other you can see because you're directly looking at it. So you can see from the external form and understand this sort of parallel relationship, and that enables you to describe the internal form. So everything you see on screen is reflected on each frame that is actually passing through the projector. So using that principle, this correspondence within, without, as above, so below, that's the whole essence of Hermetic teachings.
Yes, and that's beautifully put. Thank you. And it also it then gives people something to sort of, as you mentioned earlier, the palm is not set, like the lines at least are something that change over time, which I think is also, I'm glad that's already been touched on, because I feel like that's one misconception about this art is it's kind of in movies and TV of like, oh, someone reads your palm and then they'll tell you when you're fated to die and like everything about your life in some way being preset. But since it is something that is reflecting your inner life, since people are changing and growing individuals, what is inside of us and what is reflected in the universe is always changing as well. So I think that's important to kind of
yes.
understand. And I think you put it beautifully in the book as well.
I mean, a lot of people think in terms of fingerprints.
Mm-hmm.
Now they remain fixed.
Mm-hmm.
They don't change over the course of your life, bar if someone, say, has advanced cancer and the cancer is ravaging the body for all the protein it can find, then the actual skin starts to go very smooth, and with that, the actual integrity of the fingerprint breaks down. But for the multitude of people, the fingerprints that you're born with do not change. So it is a kind of inherent pattern that you have lifelong. But all the markings, all the features, all the little myriads of tiny little lines you can observe on the palm, they all change. And the little tiny lines, they can come and go. And for me, one of the most fascinating things I try and engage people is, if I give them a hand reading, to come back and see me in a couple of years' time, because I can take a second set of handprints from them, compare them to the ones I took originally, and then you can literally go through the hand area by area and like spot the difference. Those little cartoon puzzles you have in kiddies comics. There are 10 differences between these two images. How many you can spot? Well, that's the sort of skill that's needed to spot the difference between the hands. And for most people not particularly cognizant of their life, you don't get a lot of change. You get a sort of evolutionary change as people kind of go through different things. Maybe they meet someone, new relationship of whatever sort it is, but no major change. But if something traumatic happens, like suddenly you're driving along, bang, car crash, injured, survive it, and your whole life falls apart, and everything is disintegrate from your job to relationships to family or finances, then you get major change sort of setting in. And similarly, people can have some most horrendous experiences that happen out of the blue, and the resolution, the outcome of it is that it creates massive personal development in a short space of time. And that positive influence can be reflected comparatively quickly. One of the interesting things is change, provided it's maintained within the consciousness of the individual, change can be reflected on the hand within 6 weeks. And that is basically the physiological time for the skin to grow from the basal layer, where all the cells are rapidly dividing, and then gradually they stack up. And as they get to the outer layer, those cells are dead and they flake off. And something like 80% of our household dust is in fact dead skin. So it takes 6 weeks to go from the germinal layer to the horny layer that gets shed off. So you can understand then that if you've got factors that then create change that are more permanent after the 6 weeks, then you get whole new patterns etched into the lines. That to me is wonderful.
Yeah, that is fascinating. And to know that it's actually only 6 weeks, I think that's not something people think of. Well, I certainly had not really considered that to be as quick a change as it could be, but that's very interesting. In terms of interpreting and looking at patterns, there are a couple of things, well, there's a number of things that you talk about in the first sections of the book that are important to understand before starting to even really look at hand shape and lines and everything like that. And that is the concepts of the 3 worlds, like the Hermetic idea of the 3 worlds, an understanding of the elements and an understanding of the planets, or at least a basic understanding of astrology. Would you say that those are like some of the key components that you need to understand or be able to reference in order to kind of start to interpret things?
Indeed. Basically, as you hold up the hand, it doesn't say anything to you.
Mm-hmm.
So the skill of a hand reader is to be able to look at all the sort of nuances with its form and structure, and then put what you see into words that will communicate meaning, understanding to that person.
Mm-hmm.
So the language of the hand requires symbolism. symbolism, you apply it to the various features, hand shape, skin texture, the division of the palm into the quadrants, all the lines, all the fingers, the individual phalanges on the fingers. They're all classified with different elemental, planetary or zodiacal symbols. And with that, it enables you to start allocating meaning to different regions of the hand.
Mhm.
So once you've got a general association with whatever feature you're looking at through this symbolism, you then specifically start to observe, well, what formation do you actually see? And that sort of skill, being able to observe all the differences, is where you start to get into the specific individuality of that person.
Mhm.
So when you say take the lifeline, which is the one that curves around the thumb, that's connected with the planet Venus. And obviously, in terms of Venus, our life comes about through an act of love in our parents, and the womb is traditionally ruled by Venus. So for 9 months, we are taking on shape inside our mother's womb and acquiring a physical body, and then we're born out into the world. So it makes sense then that this particular line, being connected with Venus, is all about the energy that supports and sustains our whole physical existence. So once you've got that sort of general association, you can then look at the line in terms of its length. There's that nice, strong, clear line from beginning to end, in which case you can understand that that person has got a strong vitality that's going to endure and give them the option of being able to experience a long life. I mean, it may not actually be the full extent of their life, and they might die earlier, sort of tragically through other circumstances. But from the point of view of their health and vitality, they are strong. The inverse of that, if you've got a line that is weak, it may be full of markings, sort of islands or bars blocking it, a sort of chained effect, all sorts of things that detracts from the nice clarity, overall length. Then you've got someone whose health is marred by various stresses, conflicts, weaknesses, and so forth. So that's the principle you work with. The symbolism takes you to a particular area of the person's life, and then observing the specific formation that's unique to that person enables you to come up with information that is specific to that person.
It was fascinating to me. In your book, you talk a little bit about its connections to, historical astrologers that also practiced this art in, the Western tradition. And there's so much of what you're saying that sounds very similar. I am not an astrologer, so, but it is very fascinating. And we've had, several astrologers on the podcast as well. And it sounds very similar in that way, where there's obviously a lot of crossover in terms of, the terminology, the correspondence,
common language,
the common language, and also that same idea of having patterns that are there that you can learn from, and then kind of see how that might unfold in a person's future. But you're really looking at what those formative influences of the heavens were at that moment, shall we say.
Indeed.
Yeah. So that's very, very interesting. In terms of what you're looking for, you mentioned that there's the lines, there's hand shape, there's, the fingers themselves, the skin type. I mean, there's in your book, obviously you go through, and there's a whole slew of different things that you as a hand reader would be looking at. But I thought that what might be interesting for people in order to kind of guide us through what we're going to talk about is to look at it from a bird's eye view of what you're looking for when you first look at someone's hand. Like if you were doing a live reading of someone's hand, what is one of the first things that you're looking at? And I think my first question has to be, you address this in the book, but which hand do you choose? And what are the different reasons that you would look at one hand versus another for people?
Right. Well, the polarity of the hands is a very important consideration. So, you know, I ask people, are you right-handed or left-handed? That's at the outset. I mean, there's no reading involved. It's just the practicalities of asking them. And if they say they're right-hand, then through the life, they are going to consciously direct more energy into that hand. So the form and structure of that hand is going to reflect that person in the immediate now. The converse to that is the passive hand will have had less energy directed into it. So the patterns that are innately there are all to do with what you're born with. So there's like a past, and then there's the present. And obviously, if someone's left-handed, this principle is kind of inverted the other way around. So by looking at the past in relation to the present, you've got a perspective that enables you to see when people say come to you with a particular problem, say in relationships. It's very common that people will project all sorts of insecurities onto a partner, and it becomes self-fulfilling and the relationship breaks down and they're precipitated into the insecurities. So where has all that come from? And you'd want to look at the passive hand and see like the influence of parents, the father, the mother, or maybe their absence. You might have someone in sort of foster care or so forth, or being completely orphaned. So that is a complete anathema to them. They just can't kind of get to grips with it. So putting that into issue, say, of insecurity into perspective, you can then give advice as to make sense of the past, what they're struggling through, and as they become aware of it, you're actually giving people the opportunity to change all that. Because all the way through the hand, what you're looking for is balance, harmony. And in terms of the elements, earth, water, fire, and air, if you imagine a beautiful day and you go for a walk in the countryside, and you know the sun is warming in the sky, not blasting hot, it's not hidden behind clouds, it's just gently warming, the air is fresh, nice breeze blowing, not sort of blasting you off your feet. The earth is soft but firm, it's nice and lush, there's plenty of vegetation, and you've got maybe a stream or a lake or something to view. When you're in the countryside, with all the elements in a state of balance, there's that extra vibrance, that extra harmony. And that is the fifth element, ether, life itself, the vital force, chi, prana, however you conceive of it, varying cultural backgrounds. So whatever you see in the hand, you kind of assess from the point of view of the relative balance of elements, or the relative balance, polarity of the planets, and see the opposite, what is needed to put that bit right. So if you've got someone, for example, who has lots of energy, and yet when they come to see you, they're exhausted all the time. And you think, well, how can this be? And from the hand, you can see that there are patterns that conspire against people being active and being confident, being assertive, being able to direct their energies out into the world and achieve various goals and things. So you're looking at what's blocking that person, then you can communicate how those blocks have arisen, those fears and things from the past, what they've got to work on, suggestions for breaking down that fear, and then they become released from it. And with that release, then the lines change, as we've described, and the person can then move on. So it's all part of the wonderful language of reading hands.
Mm-hmm. And so that's, I mean, for people who have not seen your book, there's a lot of information, and there are so many different things that are involved in what you're looking at on the hand. I mean, people stereotypically, and you mentioned it, the lines are very, very important, and it's what people may be most familiar with. But there's also, of course, the shape and the skin texture and the prominence of the mounts and things like that, and relative finger lengths and stuff like that. So then it is your job then, as the person who is the reader, to judge the various, like the relative importance of all of those different factors that you're seeing.
Yeah, well, can I, you just reminded me of something which is very important to say. The overall shape of the hand is like the sort of vehicle you're born into. And, you know, if you think you've got a car or a boat or a plane or something, then each of those vehicles is designed or flourish for a particular element. So you've got a boat, it's pointless trying to drive it down the road. You won't get anywhere. You know, if you've got a car, it's pointless trying to sort of cross the oceans with it. If you've got a plane, it's pointless sort of trying to tunnel through the earth with it. We've all got sort of inherent limitations that we're born with. And those limitations tell us what we shouldn't do. And if we try to do them, it's going to be stressful, it's going to be disastrous in one way or another. And it may be a very sort of simplistic analogy, but I've helped many, many, many people answer the question what they should be doing in their life. They've come to me because they're fed up with their current life. There's no meaning, no purpose, no direction. Whatever they do is stressful, conflicted. And I look in the shape of their hand and say, wow, this is a person who could fly, and you suggest how they can fly, and suddenly they take off. So the shape of the hand is the vehicle that they're born into. And then when you look at the lines on the hand, you're looking at how a person is steering that vehicle. So the line formations will tell you whether that person is trying to drive their boat down the road, and whether they'd be better off actually floating it on the water somewhere, and so forth. And then when we've got the fingers, that's a different dimension. It's to do with the knowledge that we can draw from in order to be more educated as to how to steer our vehicle, how we learn through our experiences, how we evolve as individual spiritual beings. So putting it all together is the skill of the hand reader. So you're not just looking at one feature. The beauty of all this symbolism is it cross-references all the time. So if you've got, say, a fire-shaped hand, there's a myriad of different ways fire is reflected on the hand and the lines and mounts and the fingers and so forth. So as you entertain the notion of the fire element and what that means in terms of the energy, the drive, that creativity, you're seeing how that's being expressed. Is it, you know, going into a field that they can excel in, achieve a lot in? Or is it sort of just welling up as inattention that's causing them to be self-destructive in their life? Are they able to be truly creative, or are they just sort of doing menial stuff in order to earn a job? Have they, found their vocation and calling? In which case they find something that they really enjoy, find their purpose, and a sort of creative flow ensues. So it's putting all the bits together. That is the real skill of reading hands.
Which also kind of brings to mind, with astrology, the idea of, what things in a chart are exalted versus, being in a detriment and things like that, what are at cross purposes to one another. And then seeing what, on a chart is able to express itself easily and what is maybe not in a position to express itself. So then through looking at like a shape versus, something that is out of balance with that, like how would that impact the larger trajectory of somebody's life, and looking for things where there might be problems because of something that's not quite in alignment. So that's very interesting. It just occurs to me that that's yet another example of it crossing over with astrology very, very easily.
Indeed, I did some sort of webinar actually with an astrologer, and I had handprints and I sent over the astrological data. And then we had a sort of dialogue. He was over in the Bahamas and I was here in Wales, and we had a fascinating whole interaction. He was sparking off on ideas that he saw were prominent in the chart, and I could then respond and say, well, actually that's also reflected in this particular formation and the lines of the hand. So yeah, I mean, when I first started studying hand reading, I was skeptical towards astrology. And that was because I came to hand reading from a scientific background, which, as you know, science generally poo-poos astrological stuff. So when I got involved in hand reading, when I got proficient at it, I kind of thought, well, I was doing something concrete, pragmatic, that was better than astrology. In my arrogance, I didn't realize that what I was tapping into was the same stuff as what astrologers were tapping into. And it gradually dawned on me. I'd give a hand reading to someone and say, wow, Dylan, this is incredible. This is just what my astrologer has just said to me. And I was initially sort of miffed at that. I was hoping I was able to tell them something that no astrologer could possibly tell them. And after a while, I actually got to the point and said, oh, this has happened too often. I've got to study astrology now, kind of see the other side of the argument. And that's what led me into a much richer understanding of hand reading. And so, as you'll see, a section of my book is sort of astrological perspectives of the hand.
Absolutely.
And I feature some astrologer hand readers. And I believe the regions known as mounts, that are the sort of prominent bits that are on the palm, that are connected with the names of the planets, the origins of that are astrological, in that people who then did natal charts for people, and let's say Venus was strong in the natal chart because Taurus was rising, and Venus was well aspected in the chart, then the Venus mount here becomes prominent. And so by observing the chart in relation to the formation and structure of the hand, so a language of different regions of the hand was actually built up. So I think there's a common cultural evolution there.
Absolutely. That makes complete sense. So in terms of how people get involved with this art, you have an explanation of what's required in order to take a handprint in your book, and it's really quite straightforward and probably a little bit easier than people would think. You can also, of course, read a live reading, shall we say, of just holding someone's hand and looking at it. But can you just explain in brief what the process of taking a print is like for people who haven't seen it, and why you think that's a good idea for people who are just starting out.
Okay. Prints are important in two respects, I think. Firstly, it's one of being able to see all the features on the palm. You need contrast, really, to appreciate the full diversity of the line formations. And due to the nature of the skin, it's very difficult to see all the individual lines. I mean, I know certain hand readers will be there with their magnifying glass and the light, but you turn your attention away, maybe have a chat with that person, and you come back and, oh gosh, where was I? So taking a print, basically it's like, you know, in the art room, maybe at school, you did sort of block printing work or lino printing work, where you get various shapes, dab them in some ink, and then dab them onto paper, and you get various shapes or impressions on the paper. So taking a handprint involves getting lino printing ink or block printing colour, depending on how it's catalogued, squeezing it out onto a tile with a lino printing roller, specifically about that wide, so you've got the width of the palm there. And then you roll out the ink on the tile, get it nice and thin and even, and then you roll it across the palm. And that will transfer the ink to the hand. And with that, you then make an imprint on paper, draw around it, and then peel it off. And hopefully that is your handprint. There's a bit of a skill involved with getting a good handprint. Ideally, I always say to my students, you take as many handprints as possible in order to get 3 good handprints. So it's a bit like doing film work. You take a dozen or so different takes of every stage, and then you look for the best performance, and you select that for the film you're working on. So similarly, for the hand reading, to give maximal information to that person, you want the clearest, sharpest imprint to give the most accurate reading. Obviously, if it's all blurry and fuzzy, then you're going to be thwarted in what you tell that person. The second reason for taking a handprint is you've got a historical record of their patterns of consciousness at that time of first coming to you, so that in the intervening months, years, a second imprint can be made, and then you can compare the differences. And if you're really enthusiastic about it, particularly mums with children, they can take their handprints at sort of the early intervals, and you can watch them grow and mature into adulthood. Then maybe they can take their childhood collections and carry on that sort of progression.
Yeah.
Seeing how it
so that's the most important thing, is you've got a valuable record of that person.
And is it easier generally for beginners, do you think, to work with the sort of like the printed version? Because like you said, then you have the contrast, so you have a lot more time that you can look at those things and examine it and try to figure out, you know, the width of lines and things of that nature. Or is there something visceral about, you know, having someone in front of you that you think is also, you know, important for people who are just beginning?
Both have their merits. Obviously, if you've got a handprint, or better still, lots of different handprints, then you can sort of compare and contrast with all the information you've got in front of you. And you'll then start to appreciate how a similar region in one hand can have a multitude of different manifestations through a spectrum of hands. So that's important to appreciate. But doing the live reading, making that connection is important, Because as sort of ideas get sparked off in your head and you put them into words that you think that individual needs to kind of understand, by their response, you'll get to understand what you're saying to them rings true or not. Sometimes you get a situation where they haven't reflected much on their life, and initially they don't connect with what you're saying. And no, that's not right. No. But you watch their denial, and sometimes that can reveal the very thing that you're trying to communicate to. And so you kind of learn that, and then you come to them from different tack, different direction. What you've said to them is correct. The observation that you've made is correct, so that confirms that particular bit of your experience. So
yeah, and that's part of
the
that.
live reading is kind of important. But it is important in another respect as well. I mean, I have found in the past students who come along to all my classes and then not apply the knowledge. And I'll sort of generally tell them off and kind of send them up for being stupid and not applying it. Oh no, but we wanted to attend all your classes so we know what we've got to say to people. And I said, no, you've got to learn that for yourself. What I say to you are just the principles, the clues, if you like, as to how to apply hand reading, but you've got to go out and do it. You've got to listen to people, hear their response, and that's where you actually learn it. So I give the analogy, it's like learning to ride a bike. There's no other way than getting on the seat and pressing the pedals with your feet, feeling that momentum, and then getting the balance. And that's all there is to it. Obviously, you've got to know how to steer it and understand the road that you're traveling on. But getting that initial balance is the key part to riding a bike. That's what I say to people, go out, observe people's hands, interact with them. It doesn't matter if what you say is incorrect, learn by your mistakes. And my Buddhist teacher, who first taught me hand reading, he said, go out and make your mistakes. If it takes you 100 attempts to get something right, not only will you have the knowledge of the right answer, you will have the knowledge of 99 wrong answers. And further down the road, when you come to teach people, you can understand from all the mistakes that you made where they're at, where they're going wrong. And you also know the right answer, so you can then impart what they need to learn that is correct for them in the situation. So you say, right, go on out, make your mistakes, trip up, doesn't matter, get going. And if you've got the right attitude, you can learn from any situation in life. You can learn from a chair, especially if it falls on your head. And we kind of think, oh God, what are people going to think of me if I'm wrong, get hung up on that sort of whole pride pattern. But no, it's I think making mistakes is just as important as getting the right answer. You've learned the violin. I mean, you've played an awful lot of bum notes in your life to be able to play in an orchestra.
Years and years
Same principle
of mistakes, that's for sure. That is very true.
I mean, I once went to a boarding school, and 20 minutes after lunch was rest, and everyone was encouraged to read books. Everyone, that is, who wasn't learning a musical instrument, and probably a dozen or so people in the school all learned their musical instruments, and the worst ones were the violinists.
Yes.
The initial scrapes of the violin are just so dissonant because I haven't kind of got the musical ear to get the sense of tone right. Oh, it was a nightmare. So
There's
then
a
we
lot
all
of
were.
mistakes you can make, and it can sound very loud and very bad. You have to get those, you have to get those mistakes out. It is 100% true. If you don't do it and make all of those wrong sounds, you can never get to anything else.
That's it. You don't know the true notes then, do you?
No, that is very true. So that touches really beautifully on, you may have already feel you've answered this question, which is totally fine, because one of the things I wanted to ask you is, what do you think some of the most common pitfalls are that people fall into when they try to learn this? I mean, you just said it's that maybe people will be too hesitant to go out and make their own mistakes. Is there anything else that you see as pitfalls that you sometimes often see with students?
I think that's the biggest one. I think people can become totally self-absorbed into it. There's only one hand, and they want to know about, and that's their own. And so they will study with me, and they look through every nuance. And in the class, oh, well, what does this feature mean? I said, oh, have you been listening? I've explained that in detail in a multitude of ways. So again, it's stepping out of their comfort zone and going out to meet people. That's the sort of biggest obstacle. And I think there's also a cultural hesitancy. Now, hand reading is a topic that's largely poo-pooed or dismissed. And so it requires a degree of strength, inner strength, to go out and do it. That, I think, is initially hard for people. But I think attitudes are changing towards it, and more people are far more accepting of it. So it's getting easier. I mean, when I'm teaching students, I encourage them to go out and get handprints. Not actually necessarily read hands at that stage, but go out, meet people, take their handprints. And just the act gives people the opportunity to talk about the hand to that person, not necessarily give them a kind of full reading as such. And you can say, well, I'm just studying hand reading, and I just want to find some sample prints so I can apply this knowledge. And they'll often say, oh, I've always wondered about this feature. Do you know anything about that? And it may then coincide that you've just been taught it. So you can explain what it means and learn from it, see from their response. So there are ways and means of applying hand reading in lesser ways that don't have the full-on one-to-one confrontation of doing a full kind of professional reading. I mean, that's basically how I started doing professionally. Is I mentioned I was a dispenser for my mother, who was a herbalist. So I was dispensing, so every half hour, every hour, prescription would come out and I'd make up a medicine. But between the hour and the half hour, depending on my mother's sort of patient schedule, there was a bit of downtime, maybe 10 minutes, maybe half an hour. So I just laid out handprints on a table in the waiting room. And as patients of my mother sort of moved in and out, as I got to know them as working for my mother, I would say, oh, what are all these handprints doing on the table? So, well, I'm studying hand reading. He said, oh, how interesting. Do you know, I've always wanted my hand reading done. And that's how I kind of launched into conversation. Now, the first professional readings, this lord, a hereditary lord, Lord Kinnaird, who was in Scotland. He came down to London when Parliament was sitting, and he then sat in the House of Lords doing all sort of legal work there. And he came in and he said, oh, wow, do you know, hand reading is so interesting, but I've never had it done. Would you read my hand for me, Dylan? And I said, yes. And I said, how much do you charge? And at the time, I had no conception of how much to charge. I said, £5. And so I read his hand for about an hour or so. And he then said to me, do you know, Dylan, this has been most enlightening. And I want to thank you sincerely for what you told me. It's been very thought-provoking, very interesting. And he said, I don't think £5 is enough. I'll give you £10. And so £10 literally was the first fee I charged for people doing a hand reading. And then it progressed to £20 and £30, depending on the length of the reading.
Mm-hmm.
No, it's more these days. That was 40 years ago.
Yes.
But that's how it started, as informally as that.
Yeah.
And I suddenly thought, wow, that was easy earning money that way. It felt quite effortless earning money. And so I used to do sort of maybe half a dozen hand readings a week, and that kept me going as a student.
Absolutely. No, it's the only way to learn is by doing. Of course, studying from good people and having good influences and doing your work, but then going out and actually applying and letting people be curious with you, I think is a beautiful way to go about that process. So I had a couple of little questions. One was a friend of mine heard that I was going to do this interview with you, and their question was, what about people who have scars or marks from surgeries or things on their hand? Is that considered part of the lines, or is that different?
That's entirely different.
Okay.
I mean, the principle of hand reading is it's the whole person reflected in the palm. Mm-hmm. And that's the key word, is reflected in the palm. So, if you stand in front of the mirror doing your hair or shaving or whatever, if the mirror has got a great crack in it, or maybe some of the silver has dropped off the back of it, then your image as you see it in the mirror is impaired. But correspondingly, it doesn't mean to say that you are impaired. Mm-hmm. So it's just accidental, if you like, to the form and structure of the hand.
I see.
However, I think there can be symbolic significance in features of the hand where injuries have occurred. And I think the most memorable experience was actually occurred in my mother's surgery. One day a week, she had a student clinic. So in addition to all patients, there was half a dozen students gaining clinical experience with her. And on this occasion, there was this guy who just was continuously talking. He wouldn't shut up. If someone else had a conversation, my mother, he'd interject. He was a right pain. Anyway, he found out that I read hands, and he instantly kind of wanted to know what his hand showed, and kind of like dominated the conversation about hand reading. Anyway, jumping into doing a reading for him, his index finger was very, very short. It was kind of, if I kind of exaggerate it, that was like the length of his index finger, whereas normally it should be much, much longer than that. The index finger is very much tied up with self-image, self-confidence, how you kind of value yourself to assert your influence out into the world. And obviously, a short finger, or maybe in gesture, if that finger is held in, clasped, that's a sign of insecurity, someone who has a weak self-image. So faced with a public situation, they feel very threatened by it. Back to this guy. And I commented on the fact that he had a very short finger, and it was also slightly malformed. And so I actually asked him, have you had particular injury to the finger. And he told me this extraordinary story that he was born in the Second World War, and he was just a toddler in the Battle of Britain. And his house, where he lived with his family, was billeted by a number of RAF pilots. And in the bad old days of electricity in houses, a lot of the old wiring didn't have an earth wire. It just had two wires, a live and a neutral. And with two wires, it was vitally important that every connection is always the right way round. If they're the wrong way round, dreadful things happen. Anyway, they had problems with the electrics in the war. Electricians were in short supply. And it turned out one of the pilots, he knew a thing or two about electrics. And he offered his skills to fix the family's electrical problem. So he obliged, and he fixed the electrics, and it was all working. But it was a very primitive house in that they didn't have a proper bathroom. They had an old galvanized tin bath, and the hot water was jugs that had warmed up on the fire, poured into the bath, and it was a fairly social experience of washing. And in the middle of winter, an electric fire was turned on and was in the vicinity of the bath. And apparently, as a small toddler, he was sitting in this bath and he reached out to the electric fire. And I don't think he actually touched it, but as he got close to it, an electrical arc jumped from the fire to him sitting in the water in this metal bath. And he got severely burnt as a result, but obviously he survived. So that was a pretty close sort of near-death experience that he went through. But his original question was, well, does this actually show anything in my hand? And I simply explained to him what I've just said. A very short index finger is someone who lacks confidence, who has great difficulty kind of dealing with public situations. And as I explained that to him, he just fell quiet. And he said, Dylan, I'd never want to admit that, but you're absolutely right. I'm terrified of public situations. And he then said this whole rattling on everywhere in social situations, just a bravado. I keep that up to conceal the fact that I'm terrified inside. And it was quite interesting that that observation really rang true for him. And no one, my mother or any of his co-students in that situation ever saw him again after I'd explained that point to him in the hand reading. I think he perhaps took it too personally and didn't want to turn up to student clinic anymore. But
yeah, but that
was a sort of accidental injury to the hand, which had, I think, a psychological relevance to his whole demeanor in life.
Yeah, and therefore it's another one of those examples of, in some sense, chicken or the egg. I mean, there are things that then, by knowing about that, and as you were saying, just from the standpoint of someone as a reader, helping someone to see that as either, if you're helping them to see some of the natural strengths that they have, sometimes some of the things that are naturally not going to be the easiest for them, shall we say, or things that they might naturally struggle with, then it's easier for people to perhaps know how to deal with that in their day-to-day lives, or have greater clarity on that. So it doesn't have to be posed as like, and so you are doomed to that. But when you are at least conscious of it and aware of it, then that person could make other choices. Whether they
That's
choose to
right.
or not, that's a different story.
That's entirely their own responsibility.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
But at least you've kind of given them the options of that.
Mm-hmm.
But the wonderful thing about hand reading is people do come back to you and say, I'm ready now for another hand reading. I've followed religiously what you said and it all worked out. It made a lot of sense. And I did all the things you suggested I should do to improve my life. And it's all happened. Surely my hand must reflect that change. And 9 times out of 10, you can spot amazing transformations in the path. So
That's very,
really inspiring with that.
and
But I'd like to see more of that. I mean, I'd probably say that only about 1% of hand readings ever come back to me and give me the option of sort of continued progressional readings.
well, I will say that from reading your book, that was a new piece of information for me. I was not aware of the change that was so significant that can be seen in it. So I think that is really important that people know that, so that they know that it should be a succession. I mean, as long as you are kind of applying, changes to your life that you're interested in seeing, how that's reflected, and how those changes are going. I think that's a really fascinating thing for people to be aware of. So that is wonderful. That also ties into one of the last questions that I wanted to ask you, which I think you've already basically answered, but it sounds like in your personal work, do you feel that the way that you work with hand reading informs some of the ways that you work as an herbalist? Is there any connection to ways that you see healing and hand reading being, sort of able to partner together, or?
Oh, definitely. I mean, the maverick physician Paracelsus said that no physician was fully trained unless they could learn diagnosis through cheiromancy, the study of lines on the hand, or physiognomy, the study of the shape and the proportions of the body. And a physician basically is someone who practices physic. Physic is the Latin word for the art of making medicines from plants. So that's a true definition of what a physician actually is. So in my own experience as both a herbalist and a hand reader, people will come to me predominantly first for herbal treatment. In which case, you take a full case history, look at the diet, physical examination where needed. Perhaps they'll come with various sort of biochemical tests, diagnostic tests that the doctor's given them, and so forth. So you put all that information together. But if just say they've got a stress problem, maybe commonly upset to the digestion, whether it's an ulcer or irritable bowel syndrome, whatever. The very fact there is that component of stress means there's more to looking at the problem than just purely the physical. And this is where the hand comes in. It gives you that overall perspective of the person, mentally, emotionally, as well as physically. So that by looking in the hand and seeing what the factors are associated with that person's stress, it may be they're in work that they just can't stand. They're stuck in it. They need to be working all hours God sends them in order to earn the money, to pay the mortgage, etc., etc. So in many ways, they're trapped. They've got very little time to kind of reflect on themselves. With the hand reading, you can give them the option of finding out a field of work that they could really flourish in. And generally, if you can find something that you enjoy, it's not stressful. You're going to look forward to it. Yeah, oh, great, another day, let's get going on that. And it gains a momentum that encourages more positive things happening in your favor. And ultimately, there are many people later in their life who kind of find their hobbies turn into the very thing that they perhaps should have been doing in the first place. So the same with hand reading is you can come up with various options, make various suggestions. I mean, I had a similar situation with a woman who is actually my wife's patient. My wife is also an herbalist. And I gave her sort of instructions of what she could do in her life. I mean, she was basically just a primary school teacher. It was simple work for her, but it wasn't fulfilling her. It wasn't really giving her a challenge. And she wanted to do so much more. I looked in her hand and I could see a sort of very strong spatial sense, very strong aesthetic sense, and various other factors all led me to suggest, why don't you do interior design? And she's just looked at me, Dylan, I can't believe you just told that to me. I have been thinking for ages that's something I ought to do. I've got magazines on sort of internal design and color schemes and all sorts of stuff like that. And I said, well, look, you know what to do. You just go and do it. Follow your vision. And she's gone off and done it. And things are really sort of gaining momentum for her.
That's fantastic.
So it's lifted her out of this situation of just a dead-end job where she wasn't inspired to do anything more and more admin placed on her, as all teachers are experiencing. And inwardly, she knew she was just dying. So
yeah, and that gave her
the
some
sort of thing.
sense of the options, and that it was something that she could really flourish in, which is beautiful.
Yeah.
That's wonderful. Before we wrap up, there's two things there. I have two questions. The first one is there any last piece of advice or something that you think is really important for people to keep in mind as like a practice that you do, that you think more people should do, whether that is practicing more divination or meditation, or, you know, what is it? Is there any piece of advice or things that you want to leave people with?
I think be open-minded. As my Buddhist teacher said, you can learn from anything in life if you have the right attitude. And you know, if you allow others to form opinions for you, then you'll find yourself blocked. People you know often have vested interest in you not knowing things. So whatever you don't know in life, you can be taken advantage of. And in fact, there are whole areas of our Western economy that predate upon people's ignorance of whether it's tax law, legal law, or how to do things in a particular way. So in order to counteract that, I think you have to be open-minded and to question and to kind of look out and learn wherever you can, and not passively get people to determine your own attitudes. Don't listen to sort of attitudes in media. You can interact with it by all means, but don't just follow it blindly. People need to grow up and make their own mind up about things. And I think that's particularly true of hand reading. I mean, I've encountered many people who, oh, it's a load of rubbish. What on earth have you devoted your whole life to doing that for? That's useless. And I'm always amazed at how people who know nothing about hand reading so vociferously say it's a load of rubbish.
Very
these are kind of very educated people. You'd expect them to at least sort of allow you the opportunity to present some ideas about hand reading. Oh no, how could you possibly be taken seriously if you're going to indulge in that? What we need is proper rational knowledge. So I think, yes, being open-minded, questioning things, learn from life as you go through it is kind of very, very important.
That is very beautiful. And my very last question is, where do people find you, and what do you have that is coming up that you want to tell us about, and any courses or stuff like that you have on the agenda?
Right. Well, the best way in this sort of interconnected world to get hold of me is I've got a Facebook page, and there's a Facebook page named after my book, The Hand Reveals. So go to facebook.com/The Hand Reveals, and there I've got courses and things. I've penned some articles there. We've referred throughout this interview to my book, The Hand Reveals. There are links on that Facebook page that you can find it on, or you can go to aeonbooks.co.uk and go to their homepage and either look for me by name, Dylan Warren Davis, or by the title of the book, The Hand Reveals, and you can see it there. It's available on all the big
I'll
books,
link to all of that in the show notes.
Amazon and so forth. But if people want kind of personal instruction, I've got a big course taking off. It's based in the Bahamas, but it's in the Eastern time zone for the States. 21st of February. If you go to oraculus.com/learning Cheiromancy, that'll take you to the full details of this course. It's a full training. We've got foundation part, a sort of 10-week program that goes through all the features we've been outlining, hand shape, skin texture, so forth, through the lines, through all the fingers and everything. That's a 10-week course. And then there's a pause, another 10-week course, intermediate level, which is to do with integrating everything in the foundation course. So you learn all the correspondences, comparison of right and left hand, basically refining the skills and discipline of hand reading.
Fantastic.
And then at the end of that, it leads into an advanced stage, which is based upon all the main categories of why people come to you for a reading, to kind of equip you to the role of reading hands, whether it's sort of health reasons, whether it's emotional analysis, whether it's psychological assessment, whether it's vocation, or indeed even a spiritual awareness and understanding. And there's also the astrological stuff. Let's throw a bit of that in as well. So it leads you from the basics up to the sort of gaining a proficiency at doing hand reading, and then equipping you with going out into the big wide world and being confronted with all the various issues that people will come to see you about.
Absolutely.
So that's kicking off relatively soon,
Yes.
21st of February, if you're interested.
I'll have all those details in the show notes for people to
Great.
check out, and make sure that they can check out that link and go visit the website for that. So that is fantastic. And thank you for sharing that with us. Thank you so much for doing this, Dylan. This has been a really fantastic conversation, and I hope that we can talk again sometime in the future, so we can go into more details on another time. But this has been a really enlightening discussion. So thank you for that.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure.
Black moon above, stars overhead, don't you dare